Good morning. Good morning. This is not Wednesday, it is Saturday, and thank you for being here. For those that wish to participate in the meeting and or make a public comment, please follow the steps below. To access the board meeting via live stream, go to our board, scroll down to the board meeting video, and click play. To access the meeting agenda, visit our website and click our board, then scroll down to agenda and minutes. We're calling to order at 9:04 Rialto Unified School District Special Board Meeting of the Board of Education agenda, November the 4th, 2023, at the Dr. John Kazaluma Education Center. Board member present, Stephanie Lewis, president, Mr. Joseph Martinez, clerk, and Ms. Evelyn Dominguez, board member, and our student board member. Thank you for sacrificing your Saturday morning with us. Kane Galazzo, Superintendent Dr. Avila. Ooh, it's early. Any individual who requires disability-related accommodations or modification, including auxiliary aids and service, in order to participate in the board meeting should contact a superintendent or designee in writing. So have a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Vote by board member, student board member Kane Galazzo,
Aye.
board member Ms. Dominguez,
Aye.
board clerk Mr. Martinez,
Aye.
and aye. Public comments. Comments on the agenda item. Any person wishing to speak on the item on the agenda will be granted 3 minutes.
We do not have any.
I would like for you, Dr. Avila, to introduce our moderator, facilitator for our board workshop.
So this is Mr. Chris Keeler representing Triple F, as they are known, the law firm. And he is with us today, and he will walk us through all the steps that we need to follow today. So, Chris?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Last time, Elliot Duchamp was with me. Unfortunately, I think he's out of the country actually right now and unavailable. And so we'll miss his input. But today we continue our review of your board bylaws that are your own rules for governance of this body. And so we reviewed numerous board bylaws the last time. I think, was it in May? April. Okay, I knew it was a long time ago. So last April, we got through a fair number of policies. We made some revisions. They came back to you. You approved them in June, so that's great. And now we're moving forward with another batch. Of course, Martha has provided you with a binder that includes all of your current board bylaws. It includes a clean copy of those that you adopted in June. Also includes the red line version that shows the changes that you made in June. So it reminds you of what you've already done and the changes that were made. Previously, we identified a number of bylaws that are on the agenda to review. So if you look at your table of contents in your binder, the ones in, I don't know if that's orange or red, but those are the ones that have been changed. The ones in yellow were the board bylaws that were identified as bylaws that you wanted to review. Of course, the agenda is written very broadly. You can talk about any board bylaw you want, whether it's not highlighted at all, whether it's in yellow, or even something that you previously addressed. So it's all fair game. It's all has been agendized and it's open for discussion. So if there aren't any questions or any changes in the order, I could just jump into the first one that was next on the list to review, which is Board Bylaw 9100.
Okay, I would like to just take this moment to see if any board members had one that wasn't to prepare.
I'm good as is.
Okay.
I'm good as is as well.
Okay.
Just one quick question.
Question, I thought 9200 was the next one that we were going to look over, because I do have the list from the last meeting.
I didn't hear that, I'm sorry.
I thought 9200 was the last, are we following the old list, or are we following by the table of contents?
I'm not sure. You think,
Because I do have the last, the one that we had for the last meeting. So I don't know which one we're following.
oh, so the order.
Yes, the
Yeah,
order.
so the order this is just set in order
Okay,
as it appears currently in your board bylaws. So we can go in whatever order the
Okay,
board wants.
that's fine.
Absolutely, you're
that's
right.
fine. As long as we
Yeah.
hit them, that's all that matters.
Yeah, but I mean, we can go in numerical order, or we can jump to 9200. I'm here to,
It doesn't matter. As long as we hit them, that's all that matters.
yeah, 9200 is definitely on the list.
Okay, I would like to add on page 18, 9010.
Is that tab 18?
Tab 5.
Tab 5.
And also, I would like for us to cover 9140, and that's tab 16, page 44.
What tab is that?
Tab 16, page 44, 9140. So I think we're ready. And we'll just start by order that we had already on the agenda with those additions.
So jumping to 9200, is that, or are we
The
gonna?
ones that are highlighted, we just go in that order with addition. So if we,
So we could start with 9010,
right.
tab 5. So I actually did not read this one this morning, not being on the list, but it certainly looks like, yeah, so this is very consistent with the CSBA model policy, if not exactly the same as the CSBA model policy. And what it does is that it, of course, recognizes the right of each board member to communicate with your constituents and any member of the public. It's important as public officials that you have that freedom, but it also, and of course, a right to express your own particular views on an issue. But it also includes the caveat that you're expected to respect the authority of the board, and to choose its own representatives to communicate its official positions. So, generally speaking, there's an order of who makes statements on behalf of the governing board, and that's in paragraph 2. It's the board president, or if appropriate, by the superintendent or other designated representative. And implicit in this would be if a different board member were identified by a board majority as speaking on behalf of the board, that could be done, but the default is that the board president speaks as the official spokesperson of the board when there is a comment made by the board. Of course, you have a public information officer, and most communications are coordinated through the superintendent's office, and that's not really included in here except, the reference to the superintendent or other designated representative, and that's very normal. So it's very common, the third paragraph, to have a reference to exercising restraint and tact and promote public confidence in the board's leadership. This is often cited when there are public disagreements, and that board members who are, and I don't mean, specific to this district, I'm talking generally, we work with a lot of school districts. Sometimes there will be a decision made, not supported by every board member, and when board members who are unhappy with the decision of the majority continue to complain about the acts of the others, it undermines public confidence in the operations of the board. And so CSBA recommends that, all board members keep that in mind, that, when the board has spoken, you may not agree, but the board is moving on. And, continuous complaining about that does undermine authority. There's also a reminder of Government Code 54963 that is a legal obligation to keep things confidential that are raised in closed session. And this is a Brown Act obligation of every board member. So if what you have learned or what you learned in closed session, it means it is not for public consumption, and you have an obligation as a public official to keep that confidential. When you're speaking outside of your board seat, people generally look to what you say and assume it's official. They assume, I think the community assumes you're speaking as a board member. And when you are giving a personal view or personal opinion, it's important that you identify that as such. And that's always included in 9010. Just a reminder that when you're making a personal statement, to say, I'm speaking as an individual here, this is my personal view, I'm not speaking on behalf of the board. And that's a very common disclaimer. So here is the really interesting last one. It says that the board encourages members who participate on social networking sites, blogs, or other discussion of informational sites to conduct themselves in a respectful, courteous, and professional manner and model good behavior. So this good reminder here, such electronic communications are subject to the same standards and protocols established for other forms of communication, and the disclosure requirements of the CPRA may likewise apply to them. Anything that you do when speaking as a board member could be subject to a requirement that it be disclosed under the Public Records Act, even if it's a personal device, a private website. Also, it was on Halloween that the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in the case of O'Connor-Ratliff versus Grenier or Grenier. I do not speak French, so forgive me. But that was a Poway Unified case that you probably heard about, where a board member had a personal website where she discussed her function as a board member and gave reports on school visits, had a picture of her husband, a picture of a daughter, probably four personal posts, but the rest sounded pretty official. It was essentially a Facebook or Instagram page about her role as a board member. So she got a troll from the community, a couple of them, who wrote nasty things on her feed. She eventually blocked them. I mean, at one point, just to show you how ridiculous it was, the member of the community who disagreed with her decisions posted over 200 of the exact same messages on her page. And just filled it up, right? So all meaningful content, you would have to scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll to find any meaningful content. So almost like internet terrorism practically, except there weren't any express threats. It was just really obnoxious. So she blocked him. He sued under the First Amendment, saying you created a forum because this was wrapped in your official role. So my free speech could not be limited based on its content. They won all the way up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. It got appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. CSBA actually hired us, and I was on the team that wrote the brief that we submitted to the U.S. Supreme Court. They did not invite me to go argue at the Supreme Court. You know, we were an amicus on behalf of CSBA. And hopefully the U.S. Supreme Court will reverse that. But until then, it's important to remember not only do you need to be, hold yourself to a high level of decorum and model good behavior on your websites, but also be very conscious of a decision to block someone because it could have constitutional repercussions. So if you're ever considering something like that, you should consult with Dr. Avila, and you need some legal guidance because it is a really, really tricky area. And it was brought as a 1983 action, which is a civil rights violation, which has really expensive repercussions. So until the Supreme Court, and it'll come in the next few months, the decision will come out, and hopefully they will give some guidance. Hopefully they'll let us know that a disclaimer, if you included, this is the, personal webpage of Joseph Martinez and is not, some disclaimer on it would be sufficient to change the forum. That would be wonderful. We are hoping for guidance that will clear that up.
Is that a hint?
No, just an example. I have not checked anyone's websites prior to this, but really important stuff. So that's my summary of where you are and what this is about. And if there are particular concerns or requests for clarifications, now's a good time to discuss it.
Yeah, well, I like to bring a little bit more process-oriented. I believe when invited or, recommend to speak from an outside organization that we should have the organization clearly identified, the purpose of the meeting, the content on which they want a board member to speak on, and it should be given to the superintendent because sometimes it might come into a policy or operational, so they can select the appropriate person to attend. So I think, if we're going to represent the school district, we really need to know who's behind it, make sure we have what organization is inviting, so we can vet, and that way our director of communication can be messaging, and we can say if it's a content that we don't really have a decision on, we can decline it or accept it. So that gives us a little time to review. So that's my thing that I would like to add or process. Any other questions?
Well, I had a question,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure if it's appropriate for here or whether it would go back in 9100. I've seen where in 9100 on, I'm trying to figure the tab out here, tab 2, members of the Board of Education are state officials with local responsibilities. They have no power or authority as individuals. By major board action, a member or members may be delegated specific responsibilities. It may be addressed there, and that's a suggestion. But also, I've seen where it's addressed authority for an individual board member is, or let's see, how is it? Board members only have authority when seated at the dais. I suggest we add that, and that would be to 90-10.
200, right? Is that?
I'm looking at tab 2.
Oh, okay. I think it's also, I think we're going to talk about 9200 that is limits of board member authority that
Okay.
does a deep dive into that subject. And I think
Perfect.
all of this needs to be read holistically together, because to go to Board President Lewis's point, the default is that any board member who's, for example, let's say the Rotary Club contacts a member of this board, and since Ms. O'Kelly isn't here, we'll use her as an example, and they say, Ms. O'Kelly, please
I'm
come,
fine.
Please, oh yeah, I don't want to pick on anyone. So Ms. O'Kelly, please come speak to the Rotary Club. And she goes, and she talks to them, let's say. The default is, she is there speaking individually, and under 9010, it is her responsibility to say, thank you for asking me to be here today. I need to point out that I'm here as an individual, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the board. I'm speaking as one trustee with no individual authority to share my personal views. And that is the expectation. If it's not routed through the district and the board has not made a decision that Ms. O'Kelly will speak for the board in that case, she should have a disclaimer, and that, I believe, is the default of paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, where it says, when speaking to community groups, members of the public or the media, individual board members should recognize that their statements may be perceived as reflecting the views and positions of the board. Board members have a responsibility to identify personal viewpoints as such and not as the viewpoint of the board. If they've been assigned, or if they're designated, as the board president is designated as speaking for the board, it's different. But for other members who haven't been specifically designated, that's the default of your board bylaw, and it's consistent, as Mr. Martinez said, with the limits of board authority under law, and that will be explored more fully in 9200.
Any further input or questions?
I have a question, just for clarification, Chris. So if it is routed through the board, action has to be approved, or it has to be approved through action with the majority of the board.
That's, if there's going to be a decision made by the board that we're going to authorize someone to go and speak officially for the board who isn't the board president, then that's a board decision.
And so that does mean that we would have to have that information prior to creating the agenda for the upcoming board meeting.
Right, yeah, it would be a kind of an organizational issue there. I mean, it's uncommon to see that done. Normally, people just go and they say, hey, I'm one board member, I'm speaking as one board member, not officially on behalf of the board, and they do it. But if you wanted to send an official representative to say, I'm here on behalf of the board, it would go on your agenda.
Mr. Martinez?
Thank you, President Lewis. I am a Kiwanian, and we do Student of the Month, and I have not put any disclaimer forward. I say that I am on the Board of Education, but also a proud member of Kiwanis. So I should definitely clarify further.
So now, this Student of the Month is not being recognized by the board. The Student of the Month is selected and honored by the Kiwanis, correct?
Correct.
So you're not purporting to do something on behalf of the board. You're stating your title. So that is not the type of thing that is as worrisome as after presenting the student saying something like, and by the way, this highlights, the board's, priority, which is blah, 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 and launching into a discussion of board policy. So this is, you're just saying, I happen to be a member of the board, and I'm so proud to recognize the student. It's the Kiwanis representing the student, so I don't see that as being problematic. You're not going to be confused as taking a policy position on behalf of the board in that setting. So it doesn't create a concern for me. If it does for the rest of the board, you can vote in and make him do a disclaimer, but it's not the type of issue that I read this and say that's the type of thing that it's trying to cover.
Just wanted to cover my shoes,
Just to clarify, I am a catechist at St. Catherine's Church here in Rialto, and there's no conflict of interest there for as far as me being a board member and teaching to the youth and also to our older 18 plus who are doing their confirmation, right?
No, I mean, you have a First Amendment right to practice religion, and so I'm assuming this is a religious exercise
Correct.
that you're
Catholic,
engaged in.
correct.
You're not making policy pronouncements on behalf
Absolutely
of the board. So as long as it's important to keep those roles separate.
Correct.
and to, not show up at a school to teach something that a student missed last week in catechism, for example. But no, you have a right to continue to exercise your religion, but it's, you hear about the wall between church and state, and it's not as
Correct.
simple as that, but it's important not to mix
Those
the
roles.
two.
Also, I am a Toastmasters as well, but they know that I am a board member, but we don't speak about that issue.
So in Toastmasters, it's the type of a situation where you could, right? And so you choose not to, or if you do speak about something that is a policy issue, you clearly define it as your own personal view and that you're not speaking on behalf of the board.
Yeah.
Right. But you also have a right to free association. You have a right to freedom of religion, free association with, whether it's political parties, whether it's social groups, whatever. You maintain all the rights of a private citizen. You just have to watch the boundaries. Boundaries
correct.
are important. And
So
not make it appear that you're acting on behalf of the board.
Correct. And no issues with being a team soccer team mom or anything, correct? Because I am that too.
Yeah, well, you're quite busy.
I'm very, I have
the-
three boys,
Yeah,
boys,
generally
active
no,
mom.
and we'll talk more about we'll dive deeper in the limitations on board authority. For example, as a soccer mom, you wouldn't tell the principal of a school, we need the gates opened at X time
no,
for
no.
practice, right? So again, we're not mixing the two. It's you have a freedom to support your children and their, youth soccer and whatever else they're doing.
I
So,
just do snacks.
snacks
But
are
the
great.
issue is if you attend another district function, or receive an invitation, that needs to give us time to vet or, make sure who's requested, is it approved, or things like that. So when we're going into the professional of another organization, that's where the process, I think.
Well, especially if the expectation is that you're appearing there on behalf of the board or the district. That's where it matters.
Okay, next, any further question on this policy item?
I think it'll be covered in 9200.
Okay, Dr. Abdullah.
Just one more question from me, Chris. In the line of work that we do, some things come last minute, invitations from various organizations or what have you. Could the board consider adding language in whichever bylaw it may be appropriate, again, to defer to board president to either accept the invitation or for board president to delegate without it coming to the dais? Is that possible?
Yes, it is. That's something that could be done. So as it is, the board president already can do that as your board bylaws are written. So whoever's board president can appear and speak on behalf of the board. You could add language about delegation. You want to be careful about that because your board president would want to make sure that that if someone's expected to go make a policy pronouncement, that there is a policy already in place,
Yeah.
and that they're not going to be making it up or deciding on behalf of the board and making some new policy pronouncement at another public agency or something like that, right? So you're going to have to use discretion. If a request comes in, do we know what this is about? Do we know what our position is? Are we comfortable authorizing someone to go speak on behalf of the board without meeting together as a board to figure out, well, what is our position? What is our policy on this? So, but there are lots of situations where you must exercise discretion and think through issues, and then you can delegate authority. So absolutely, the short answer to what was previously a very long answer is yes, that can be done.
So just to summarize, the change or addition will be having a clear statement of purpose for the engagement, the organization or who's behind it, and a timeline for it to be vetted, and for the superintendent to select or designate someone to be there in case a policy issue should arise. Because I think that frees up the board president to know the accurate information, the full, and to either pick or select, and it frees up the superintendent to be able to vet and verify, because usually when you go into another territory, you need to ask their superintendent and make sure things are, correctly went through their channels too.
And I would suggest that it be, if there's going to be a delegation of authority to speak for the board, that it would be the board president after consultation with the superintendent.
Yeah.
Because that would be the right way to do it. So we can write up some suggested language that contemplates these issues, and of course, they come back, you can accept, you can reject, you can modify, but we can put it in a form that captures these ideas.
Okay, great. The next item.
It's tab 7. This addresses the organization of the board, your annual organizational meeting that will be coming up next month. Addresses the election of your officers, president, vice president, and clerk. It doesn't go into detail about their roles. That's a different section, and we talked about some of that last time. And this is very consistent with general practice out there. The one thing I note in my copy, at the bottom, it says no board member shall serve more than blank consecutive years in the same office. You may not have designated that. What this covers is then if a board president could have 2 consecutive terms or 3 consecutive terms, same for the vice president or the clerk. That is, it's common to not allow more than 1 consecutive term. Most districts say no more than one term at a time. But I've seen some that don't have that, and I've seen, someone serve 2 years in a row. So actually, I saw someone serve 3 years in a row, and it was probably a good thing in that district. So it's really up to you. You get to decide, what your term limits are. And that's just serving as an officer. That's not.
Dr. Avila?
Chris, I believe I saw it in one of the bylaws, not sure which one, but that speaks to rotating of offices with the board here specifically.
It does not say it here. And when you say rotating, do you mean based on like each?
In successive order.
So the vice president the
Becomes
next year becomes the president, and then the clerk becomes the vice president, and then you elect a new clerk, and then it just recycle through. And that's very common to be done in practice, and it's very common not to be written into the bylaws in the rare situation where someone comes up and it's their turn to be president, and the board decides there's no way we can do this. This person should not be president. And again, I'm not talking about this district, but so it's a super common practice. It's more rare to have it written into the bylaws, but it's a respected practice that is rarely deviated from in a lot of districts and would only be deviated from in kind of a unique situation.
Okay. So I'll look for it and find it to
Okay.
see exactly how it's written.
Any questions, comments? Okay.
Yeah.
Our next policy?
And there may be, I'll check to make sure the timing on the meeting is the most current, because they did change the window for holding your organizational meeting a few years back. So I'll make sure that's up to date here.
Board Clerk Martinez?
I just wanted to point out that we're moving on without, let's see, towards about two-thirds down, where Mr. Keeler pointed out, the board shall each year elect its entire slate of officers. No board member shall serve more than, we're leaving that blank.
Well, right, that I was suggesting that you consider what that should be. I think Dr. Avila said if there's an obligation to rotate every year, then that would be a 1, right?
Even if you rotate, we still have to vote and say, okay, we're rotating, it's Stephanie's turn to be president, it's, Martinez to be turned clerk. We still have to vote them in, so we do have that obligation to vote regardless if they're, gonna rotate. So we do have that right too.
Historically, the problem has been that some members have experience running meetings and so forth. Others don't. They're new. So when a unexperienced board member comes in, sometimes the board will say, okay, well, let's move them in as clerk or vice president. An experienced one, there's no issue. I came in as vice president, had no problem because I'd been running meetings for years and years. On the other hand, a lack of experience can create a problem. So that can be addressed here, but I'm not sure how.
Any further comments?
I propose that, we write, no board member shall serve more than 1 term, and then we rotate, like you said, as a practice, as a common practice, but have that language in there saying that, we rotate every year. That's my opinion.
I have no problem with that, adding when possible. Because when I came in, 3 board members were elected. Had one of the other sitting board members step down, there'd be a problem. Because, but if the only one was president the previous year, then we have to find some way of doing the best for the district in the respect that they have to, because no one else may be prepared.
Correct, that's true.
So
Very
that's
true.
why I say when possible.
I propose that we're going to defer for you to come up with some language. You hear the essence of what we're trying to accomplish here. Dr. Avila is going to bring forth the documentation that he has and then write up a language for us to look at again and make sure it has our desire, express wishes.
Yeah, that's great, and I can just say, it could be language like, it is the expectation of the board that no board member will serve more than 1 consecutive year in the same office, and that officers will rotate each year. Something like that, where it's your expectation, that's what we expect to happen, but there may be a good basis for deviating from that. So it sets up, this is the model, this is probably the best way to do it, but there may be extenuating circumstances. So something like that is what I could work on with Dr. Avila, that captures the intent without locking you into something that could be problematic.
Excellent.
Okay, great.
I'm good with it then.
And our next,
So tab 16, board representatives. And this is something that commonly happens at the organizational meeting, I assume, where during the organizational meeting, you are selecting representatives for whether it's CSBA or whether it's the County Committee on School District Organization, or representatives to participate with those organizations on behalf of the board each year. But it can also come up during the year. For example, the city of Rialto says we're creating a task force for, whatever it is, vandalism, and we'd like a school board member to be on that, and it comes up in the middle of the year. That's going to be something that the board decides on. It's good language here, which is almost never followed by any district I have ever seen. The second paragraph, when making such appointments, the board shall clearly specify the authority and responsibilities of the representatives, including not limited to reporting back to the board regarding committee activities and/or actions. Board representatives shall not exercise the authority of the board without prior board approval. It's very common to just appoint them to positions and boom, we're done, and we've moved on. So it would be really good to think about this, as these positions arise and consider what are the responsibilities, what's the scope of authority that we want to endow this person with. Just almost never happens. I don't think I've ever seen it. So, but it certainly is a best practice. The committee discusses a topic on which the board has taken a position. The board member shall express the position of the board. Makes sense. When contributing his or her own ideas or opinions, clearly indicate that you're expressing an individual idea or opinion. Again, we'll talk more about this in 9200. So the rest is very, just consistent with what I mentioned before about the county committee. So I don't know if there are other comments or concerns about this. As written, I think it's a good policy. We can check for any CSBA updates where we see the breakdown is actually in the implementation.
This would come up in November during reorganization, because at that time, we normally appoint somebody to attend county meeting
Yes.
and be a voting member for the board. And we won't know who to vote for until somebody runs at that meeting. So out of that, somebody may be reelected, they may have nobody, and then finally somebody steps up. Then the board has no way of taking action prior to that vote.
So normally the organizational meeting is going to be held in December, and so it always comes up after the election. And so you're considering these appointments after we know how the election has shaken out.
Yes, members have been seated. The reorganization has taken place. We have new officers, and the next step is, okay, who will attend these meetings as a board representative? Sure, the board president could do it, but he or she has plenty on their plate, as
Yeah,
you
we
know.
usually vote for someone.
As
Yeah.
a member.
Yeah, so, they can't have any restrictions on their vote, basically that. If we know somebody, for example, one year, a council member from this city was running, and well-known, fair-minded, so it would be good for the district to vote for this person. So it was like, okay, we can discuss this now before going to the meeting. But most times that doesn't happen.
So I'm not sure, is there a way to, policy-wise,
Yes, hand it to our attorney.
it's going to be super fact-specific, right? Just depending on specifically what's coming up at the time.
One of the bylaws, it says that I think it's in 9100 for the reorganization of the board, it says that the last week of November is when the reorganization begins. So maybe if we can coincide this bylaw with that other one, we can decide then and there, who we can elect. If we're going to do the reorganization, we can coincide these two bylaws together. I think it's 9100.
But the question is, things come up.
Exactly.
And so it's the give of being flexible for committees and to be able to, I think we could cover that by placing on the agenda and elect that board member to be their representation. So, you know, it's not the current ones that we have standard that we tend to elect, but we can have that wording that, you know, we can put it on the agenda and then we can elect a representation from that and they will speak for the board at that particular office.
Yeah, so what 9100 says is that the annual organizational meeting of the board shall be held within the 15-day period commencing on the last Friday of November of each year. So that triggers a window period from the last Friday in November, moving forward 15 days. And it's during that period, that window period, that you have to hold your organizational meeting. I think I mentioned that I was going to check the window period because I think that window period changed. So we're going to update this to have the new window period, which is later. It's been pushed out farther so that recognizing that things need to shake out before you do your organizational meeting.
I will give Sacramento credit for one item.
For one, fixing one. They created 10 other issues, but they fixed one. So we'll update that, and I think it does make more sense now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Any further discussions or questions? Okay, let's go to the next item.
9200. Okay, so this is tab 19. And so by way of like big legal background, the Ed Code says the governing board acts by majority vote. And it defines majority vote as a majority of the full membership of the board. This is a 5-member board. So regardless of how many attend a meeting, you always need 3 votes for a yes. So you have 3 members here. If you were to take action on anything, it would require 3 of you saying yes. It's, you know, not like city council where 2 out of 3 in this situation would pass it. We have different rules under the Ed Code. But knowing that this, you are the embodiment of the board. You are the policy and ultimate decision-making body of this board. You act only by majority vote in a public meeting under the Brown Act, right? With really rare exceptions related to collective bargaining, that you can make decisions outside of a regularly noticed meeting, recognizing the exigencies of collective bargaining sometimes. The midnight call that we think we have a settlement, and, you know, anyway. But what this tells us is that you don't have individual authority. As an individual, you are an extraordinarily well-informed member of the public, but you do not have authority to make decisions, settle complaints, direct the service of administrators or school site personnel. You don't conduct any sort of investigation that binds the district or have special access to do things unless the board says you have special access to do these things. So that's what this is meant to cover. Again, it begins with a recognition that the board is the unit of authority. Board members shall hold the education of students above any other partisan principle, group interest, or personal interest. Again, thinking of the collective good and your role as one of 5 on the board. Second paragraph, I already kind of covered that you have no, you can't exercise any administrative responsibility with respect to the schools or command the services of any school employee. Now, this next one is important and, you know, has been an issue in a lot of school districts that I've dealt with. Individual board members shall submit requests for information to the superintendent. Board members shall refer board-related correspondence to the superintendent for forwarding to the board or for placement on the board's agenda as appropriate. So 2 points here. Information requests going to the superintendent. You know, that can become quite burdensome if individual board members start making requests for information that, going to take 25 hours of staff time to compile, right? I'm sure you have many little questions. Hey, what's happening with this? And, how did our scores do? Or, whatever. And absolutely, call the superintendent. He can answer these, small questions when there are requests for comprehensive reports and big issues. Sometimes I'm sure the superintendent will say, let's push that to the board and see if it's a board priority. Sometimes that's written into these policies where in districts where it's been an issue, where they'll write in language, and I'm saying I don't even know if it's been an issue in this district, but I've seen it in a number of districts where they add language saying that if a request for information will require substantial staff time to respond to, it's something that is sent to the board to determine, if it will be done, and if so, what the priority will be.
I concur with that. I also had another clarification. So as individual board members, our authority is not to ask students to attend any function, outside or whatever, to serve. How is that?
Yeah, and I guess there'd be a distinction between doing something on behalf of the board and doing something as an individual and making sure that you're clearly saying, I'm doing this as an individual. I think you should, as an individual board member, I have no authority to promise you a position on this committee, but it'd probably be a good thing if you applied. Something like that, yes, that's allowed. You have free speech rights, you're allowed to be engaged, you're expected to be engaged, right? But saying, hey, I can get you on this committee, no, you're not allowed to do that, right? As an individual board member, if it's a board decision, you're not going to hold yourself out as inviting someone and saying, I'll get you on that committee, just as an example.
I think I'm talking more like maybe I want some high school students to usher at an event I'm having or serve at something. Where's the line is we have to recognize the student and the liability, and the superintendent needs to be notified and things like that, because just because you're a board member, you ask, they might think that it's a function that's been approved. Where's the liability? How should we clarify that?
Yeah, I'd ask Derek Harris what he would think about that, because as a lawyer, I get really nervous on stuff like that. We've had situations where, for example, a high school band was invited to a non-school event, and it was a board member saying, hey, why don't you show up at, jazz band if you show up at this event? And it could be a political fundraiser, for example. And if we're using district resources to have a band at a political fundraiser, we've got, questions about, is this a field trip? What's our insurance coverage on this? Are we paying staff to be there? If not, if the board president or whatever board member says, just approaches the band director individually, says, hey, I can't pay you, but boy, it'd sure be great if you brought the band. You've got this cloak of authority that people want to say yes to you, right? They don't want to say no to you. And so it creates all kinds of problems if it's going to look like you're exercising authority or even just pressure, and then suddenly we have a school activity that looks like a school activity but isn't really a school activity. We've got all kinds of liability and coverage issues. It's that type of thing as a lawyer really scares me. Okay, and it's not, even if the person is not saying, I'm doing this as a board member, I'm asking you. Anything you ask of any school person, you're a board member asking it, right? And it carries, a lot more weight. I'm a partner in my law firm. If I were to ask someone to come help me move on Saturday, one of my associates, That's, they don't feel like they can say no, right? They feel like they have to say yes. And it's problematic because I have this apparent authority, because I can make things or influence decisions. I might not be making them on my own, but I can influence decisions that impact them. So there's this inherent disparity. I'm very concerned about stuff like that. So, ushering, band performance, whatever it is, if it looks like the school, looks like the district, you should not be requesting it. And they should be run through official channels, make sure you're covered by insurance, you followed all the proper procedures. We don't want, Rhonda to get a labor issue that suddenly, we owe overtime to somebody, or, an unfair practice charge, whatever it is. There are a lot of potential impacts in a situation like that. So again, it's case-by-case analysis, very fact-dependent, so I can't give you a, very, black and white answer, but it's something to be careful about.
So in the assets of, if it's not school-related, if it's not anything that perceives, like you said, it's not, if it's not seen as a school function, it's not perceived as a school function, then it's not a liability issue or anything, correct?
Well, it depends. How do we know these kids? How do we, the
Yeah, if it's
example-
not your own kids, then they're students within the district.
Yeah, so the example that you gave was students ushering an event, for example. So let's say I'm involved in community theater, and I need some ushers, and I'm a board member, and I go to the principal and I say, hey, do you have some great kids who want to be ushers? And so I've done this very informally, but the principal might feel like, yeah, as a board member, asking me to get some ushers. So I'm going to get some kids for this board member. And so that really blurs lines. If I know these kids from soccer,
Oh, yeah, I know lots of kids.
and if I make connections through soccer and I say, look, I'm doing this as a soccer mom, not as a board member, and you're invited to participate, again, we've got constitutional rights of free association. The lines are not as blurred if we can indicate that we have a personal connection outside of school with these kids. But once you start involving district staff, or if the only connection I have with these kids is through school and through the district, I'm really worried about that. Okay, but again, super fact dependent, but I am allowed, like, if I were a board member, I'd never be driving kids around in my car to
Correct.
do school-related stuff.
Correct.
But if I'm a Sunday school teacher and my Sunday school teacher, co-teacher, and I are taking them to get yogurt, and they happen to be students of the district, but I really know them from St. Mary's or, whatever it is, that's different. And so it can be really complicated and fact-dependent. But we just need to be very careful about lines.
Correct.
How do we know these students? What are the
Absolutely.
connections? Is it clear that we're acting as an individual? Do we have a very strong link to them outside of the school district? Those are all important
Yeah.
considerations because we want to stay very clean. And Derek may even think that I'm too lenient in this regard, but I'm not going to tell you can't, have interaction with students from church or from soccer or something like that.
Ms., did you have any further question?
More a statement.
Okay.
As a board member, we get lots of emails, lots of invitations, lots of opportunities. And the only way that I can see that historically, I've just routed everything through the superintendent's office. That way, not to overburden you, or specifically Martha. That's how I've tended to handle things. They all seem to come at the same time every year, clockwork. Certain months carry certain agenda items. So, and I'm not talking board agenda. But in general, I guess, just route everything through the superintendent, just as a meeting. I want to talk to Derek, superintendent. Can we have staff address it?
think that's the best practice.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point about maybe the superintendent, Mr. Harris, and yourself can really look at the language to make it clear because, the liability issue, and there was a case, I think in Claremont, where a board member had some of the students at an event in the house, and it went awry. And so the parents, was upset, and I think that board member was removed. So it's really, when you go into outside events, you don't have control over what's going to happen. And so therefore, the students felt pressure to stay or complete, and then it came back. And so at that incident in Claremont, the board wasn't even aware, the superintendent wasn't aware, of this type of function, and the parents really wasn't aware of what type of event. They just sort of took it on the board member's word. So I think if the task force between you, can come back and bring us some language to make sure it's clear in this day and age, because you have, FaceTime and Instagram, and they record events, so we need to be clear on that.
Yeah, and the example you give is like the perfect example of the nightmare scenario. I mean, it was about as bad as it could be.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. I like the idea of a task force. Yeah.
Any further questions? I don't want to put you on the spot, Kane, but as a student and the voice of the students, sometimes getting requests, how do it make you feel, or,
To address what has been said, I think when we talk to an adult, I think a general idea is that the student has to kind of follow what the adult says, because I think that's how students were raised, and it's kind of hard to say no, especially if it's someone who is of authority. But I think but also if the person who's asking us treats us kindly, we would also say yes. So I guess it depends on the person who's asking us, because some students, if they don't want to do it, then they won't do it. But there are students who want to abide by what an authority figure says.
Thank you for your input. That's very important. So I think the lines need to be clear, and the task force can work on some language for us to look at.
Yeah, and I don't know if Keenan might have some guidance for you on that as well, the third-party administrator of your insurance claims.
Oh, yeah.
I'll just emphasize a couple things I didn't talk about previously. Any board member approached directly by a person with a complaint should refer the complainant to the superintendent, so the problem may be resolved per your normal procedures. There's great safety in following process, and you have very detailed processes, numerous ways for people to pursue complaints, and holding something back and trying to resolve it on your own does not have the safety of following process. It's inconsistent with your level of authority. Again, you work as a group, you have authority as a majority of the board, and so the requirement is to immediately pass these on to administration to follow proper processes. And then there's a caution about any board member who has a child in the district, and it says, be aware of your role as board member when interacting with district employees about your child. Because of his or her position as a board member may inhibit the performance of school personnel, the board member should inform the superintendent or designee before volunteering in his or her child's classroom. That's just something that is almost universal practice as far as I know, that if a board member who's also a parent can be, and I don't mean to use the term intimidating as anything that you purposely do, but you show up, it's hard to separate parent from board member, right? And so the superintendent's supposed to get the tip off if you intend to volunteer in the classroom. And I would say also probably volunteering in any capacity with the school for a special event or something like that. It's always good to give the superintendent a heads up. And then it just says you'll follow the Brown Act, and that people who are elected but not yet seated are already covered by the Brown Act as well. So that's important for, when someone gets elected who hasn't yet been seated, to tip them off that they're covered by the Brown Act already and give them those cautions. So, okay, any?
I do. I have a couple questions. So as far as, I do have 3 children in the district. Usually as a mother, moms usually take the first role as, interactions with teachers versus the dad. It's usually common practice. Not always, but in my case it is. As a parent, obviously I do walk on campus as a parent, I do, as a parent, I do have rights as a parent to have a meeting, parent conference, parent conference, with my teacher without having anybody to be present as a witness, just because of that intimidation factor, that, like you said, an unintentional intimidation factor, correct?
So you have the rights that any other parent would have.
Correct.
So you have a right to meet with the principal. You can request a meeting with the teacher. Principals at the site will tell you that sometimes that they do not always automatically facilitate a meeting immediately between
Correct.
the parent and the teacher. There may be situations where the principal sits in, and I'm not commenting at all. I have no idea about the situations here. But any parent can request a parent-teacher meeting. Teachers who are comfortable having that meeting will have that meeting. Sometimes teachers are not comfortable and they'll ask for an assistant principal to be there, or a principal to be there. And so, parents do not have a right to insist on a meeting with only the teacher. That is not a parental right. Admin can be present if admin believes their presence is necessary, and I've seen that hundreds of times happen. And I've seen parents say, and it's usually, and I'm not talking about a parent who happens to be a board member. I'm talking about just parents in general, and they may have created an adversarial relationship, or it's a complex issue that involves, multiple departments like special ed and the regular ed teacher. And, it can be because of the complexity, it can be because of the relationship, it can be a number of factors why the teacher may be hesitant to have a meeting alone, or the principal will say, I don't want you meeting alone, I want to be there. So again, it's not an inherent parent's right to come onto campus and insist on a meeting. It's not an inherent right to insist on a meeting only with the teacher, but you have the rights of any parent to request a meeting with your teacher, and the principal and the teacher should follow normal protocols, and if they're comfortable having the meeting, then they have the meeting. If the teacher is uncomfortable and says, I want an AP present, then that's the way that would happen with any parent coming in for a meeting. So, but there's not a policy to say you must always have the principal present. There's nothing in this board policy that requires that. This board policy says, essentially, the only time you're treated differently than any other parent is when you're volunteering. And when you're volunteering, you should give notice to the superintendent. Otherwise, your rights are consistent with the rights of other parents.
Okay, and usually that, like, just for clarification, that for a principal to sit in, it would be if it's an adversary relationship.
Or complicated, or for whatever reason, or it just depends. I mean, there are just a bunch of different situations. It's not always because it's adversarial.
And for if that AP was to sit in, the confidentiality does have to be in place, correct? Whatever is spoken at that meeting, correct?
Yeah. I mean, we have, if it's about student information, the obligation is to maintain student information confidential, and there has to be a legitimate educational concern for discussing that with any other person, any other district employee. Just because I'm a district employee doesn't mean I have access to your child's information. I have to have a legitimate educational interest to know about your child. So that's an important thing to emphasize. And just because you're a board member doesn't mean information about your kids has less confidentiality. You have all the rights of a regular parent, and your students, your children have all the rights of a regular student.
I just want to check in. What is the pleasure? Do you want to take a break, or would you like for us to power through and have lunch and leave by 11? So do we need a break, a stretch? Power through? 10 minutes? Okay, well, we'll break right now. Martha, just
Sorry.
for the count, how many
Can we go off?
policy has we covered so far?
So we've completed 3 as of now.
I think we have 3 to go that have been identified.
Strong work, team. No, not yet. Okay, Edith and Matthew, we're ready. Great. So we had a refreshing break, and now we're powering through.
Yes.
And let's move forward.
Okay, so the next bylaw is 9230, related to orientation. The policy behind this is making sure that all members receive the support and information they need to become effective members of the board. New incoming members are supposed to receive an orientation designed to build their knowledge of the district and an understanding of the responsibilities of their position. There are no express requirements, but it says it may include the provision of information, support, and/or training related to board functions, policies, protocols, and standards of conduct. Talks about a meeting as early as possible following election. Board president and superintendent develop an agenda for the meeting and identify resources that may be useful for incoming board members. You're supposed to get a copy of the Brown Act, and that's something that absolutely I encourage every board member to review. Additional information may include the bylaws, conduct of board meetings and other board operations, governance standards for ethical conduct, legal requirements related to conflict of interest and prohibited political activity. I think that's something that should be done regularly as well. Just a little comment, there's also been a change to the law as to avoid pay-to-play situations. So
And clarify.
yeah, there's a new law saying that donors to your campaign, that that there's an abstention and a disclosure requirement anytime a contract comes forward that's brought forward by someone who was a donor to your campaign. And that's something that previously was not an express issue for local agency officials. It's something that's new, and so it requires that you be conscious of the individuals and companies that would donate to your campaign. You can't accept something from exceeding the threshold amount, which I think is $200, while a decision is pending that would impact monetarily that individual or that company. And then there's a sit-out period after receipt of a donation, a campaign donation, where you could not act on a contract or another decision that would have a financial effect on that donor. Now, you are all familiar with requirements related to sources of gifts and the Political Reform Act, but you've never had to worry before about sources of campaign contributions because those just weren't covered for you. So this is a new requirement, and if you haven't had training through CSBA on this, I would recommend that you seek it out during the CSBA conference, because I would expect it to be covered this year. If it's not covered this year, I've trained boards on that as well, and I'd be happy to give you a general conflict of interest refresher, Form 700 refresher, and address this new law, which is just something, you never had to worry about before, and now suddenly you have to worry about it. So something to think about, and it's mentioned here as part of orientation, and I think it's absolutely necessary for new people, but I also recommend refreshers. So I got sidetracked. Protocols for speaking with district staff, members of the public, and the media. I think those essentially board bylaws we've just covered, right? I think in an orientation we should talk about those. And publication on effective governance practices. CSBA, of course, has probably the best trainings on good governance, and I think they're a great resource for that. Um, it goes on to say that specific background information should be provided to incoming board members by the superintendent about vision, goal statements, local control and accountability plan, other comprehensive plans, student demographic data, student achievement data, district policy manual. This is something that I've seen done by some superintendents, individually as new board members come in, and they may have a day where they meet with the different lead agents and talk about their department and the LCAP and performance and, where they are in, HR and different things like that. And it's a best practice. Talks about you can do a tour of district schools and facilities and introduce them to district and administrative staff. And then finally, incoming members are encouraged to attend the CSBA annual conference, including the orientation for new trustees. I've done a Brown Act and a conflict of interest workshop there. In fact, I did the conflict of interest workshop for new board members for years, and I got tired of it. So I'm not doing it this year, but I did it for many years, and it's the new trustees, and it's absolutely a good training. But I think all trustees should be encouraged to attend CSBA because there's so much good information available there. So anyway, that's just me pontificating. But this is a good policy. It's very broad. Most districts do not have as comprehensive a board orientation as seems to be recommended here. Of course, nothing here is binding, but this would be a very thorough board orientation, and I think would be very effective. So I don't have any legal concerns with that, but if there are questions or comments about it.
Are there any questions?
I do. I think that there should be some timeframes put on here. As far as the first paragraph where it says as early as possible, the election appointed by the board members, where the board president or superintendent or designee shall make an agenda for the meetings. When I came on to board, it was a little rocky, and I never met with the board president for an orientation with her. So I think that there should be some kind of some kind of language in there saying that, within the first month of election or the first month of, getting sworn in to be, that meeting process to occur, because obviously we're not going to be here forever. The district has been running for 118 years, and obviously we're going to be long gone for more than the district is going to be long lived. So there's going to be different board members. So I think that language should be there for new board members in the future. So I think that language should be there. Also, in the the third paragraph, on the top it says that the board president, but then it's not consistent at the bottom, where it says, in addition to the superintendent or designee, it omits the president. So as part of the president, I believe that language should also be there in the third and in the fourth as a tour, since I do believe that the president or the superintendent or designee can give a tour of the schools. Unless there is circumstances to where, it's a new board president and, like Mr. Martinez says, they're kind of new to it, they don't know the role as well, and, circumstances where it can be different. That would be, the superintendent's role to do that tour, because, when I came on, I never got the tour of the entire district or, the orientation as well.
Okay.
Those are
that's
just my
been
concerns.
stated. When I came on, we were on Zoom, so I've never met the board for 2 years. So there's always going to be different circumstances and things like that. But that conference is very, very, I think you were able to attend the conference before you sworn in. And, you pick your orientations and things like that. So I think it's complex about, the membership and the time people were sworn in. I know that Mr. Martinez has been working on a orientation booklet pertaining to the nuances of Rialto Unified School District.
Which he did provide to me
So-
as well.
Yeah, so I think, I think the language, like you said, is really comprehensive. And to put a time frame, you never know what the time the person, comes to the board or elected and things like that, so the process. So, yeah, all the schools were closed, weren't open, and that was 2 years. So therefore, anyone in this role need to have to, because this is a stipend position, will have to adjust. We are not staff, and we're not district employees, so to get a tour of all the schools as a president, I think it is on the superintendent or his designee, because they're the ones that have jurisdiction.
So I would say, it's certainly within the discretion of the board to decide who's in charge of these different things. I just point out the second paragraph that talks about these orientation sessions, and says that the board and the board president and the superintendent will develop the agenda. That's very consistent with the agenda setting requirements of regular and special board meetings that are, the responsibility is shared between the board president and the superintendent to set the agenda. Now, these are different because these are not anticipated to be public meetings, right?
Right.
Normally in practice, these are meetings between one new trustee and the superintendent and cabinet, and the tours are, you are not going to have 3 board members on the tour. We're going to have at most 2 when you're doing a tour. But again, you're setting an agenda for normally a one-on-one or a 2-on-1 meeting with a new board member, not during a public meeting. But again, board president, superintendent set agendas for many things. The others are different because it's not the agenda setting responsibility, and it's information and access that can be provided by the superintendent. So you can choose to leave it as just the superintendent being responsible for this, or you can add the board president, because these are your board bylaws and you get to choose. So, but I was just trying to draw a distinction between the agenda setting responsibilities and the other 2 paragraphs there.
Any further questions or discussion? Comments? Okay, our next item.
So is there consensus on changing as early as possible to setting a time frame, like within 30 days, within 45 days, within 60 days, or, as close to 30 days as possible, or, something like that? I know that.
Well, they're sworn in, November? Oh,
December.
yeah,
December.
yeah, December, and then you're going through the,
Reorganization.
reorganization, and then it's January, February. So I think narrowing it down to a timeline is sort of restrictive, in my opinion. But, definitely, I think the superintendent has always met and discussed, because at that same time, if we're rotating officers, you're also rotating the president too at that same time. So therefore, to me, it's fine, it's stated. I think on an outside level of setting the agenda, the outgoing will probably set an agenda template for the incoming, which will be more practical.
So I was just trying to figure out if there is a consensus for us to bring back a revision to add a specific time frame. It sounds like you're not feeling that that's necessary. Or to add the board president into the bottom 2 paragraphs of that first page. So,
Board Clerk Martinez?
There are certain things that could be prepared, personal opinion, not as a board member, but as somebody who has been newly elected many times. There should be something, here are the files, here's what we know about the district, here's our current contracts, let's schedule a tour, Here's training available through CSBA, Masters in Governance, that kind of thing. What we can have is something written down. How do
A
we
handbook.
get hold of policy? What are the best practices, things like, and it could be misinterpreted as a problem, things like if there's any questions, please route them through the superintendent's office. That would be the best practice, but that could be viewed as controlling unless there was a CSBA recommendation, or by the recommendation of the board, it is recommended that these be the best practices. And it could be 2 pages. I've got the template worked out already. I handed over right away. But that could be handed out during the reorganization meeting to any new members, or as soon as we know who they are. But they aren't sworn in until the reorganization meeting.
I work with a district that actually does their orientation prior to the prior to them being seated. So between the election and the reorganizational meeting, the superintendent meets with the incoming board members and starts the orientation process, provides them, probably information similar to what you've compiled, and that can be done.
And they don't
As long as it's non-confidential information, you wouldn't start, providing.
Here's what we discussed in last closed session.
Yeah, even
Of course
though
not.
even though a board member-elect could come into closed session and would have all of the same obligations to keep it secret, it's not done. I mean,
Questionable.
yeah. So I wouldn't do it. But you're right. We wouldn't pass confidential information to them until they're sworn in.
Risk management would throw a flag on that.
So, perhaps I can work with Dr. Avila to come up with, some time frame by which core information would be provided, and then have, retain as early as possible language for most of the other stuff that may be logistically more complex.
I mean, a manual's great, but we also got to remember that not everybody is, not everybody learns. We also got to remember that not everybody learns by reading. Other people learn as tactile, as auditory. I can't just learn as a reader. I have to sometimes experience it and tangible and as a tactile learner. So I mean, I have to sometimes read things 2 or 3 times to be able to understand it, and that's just because English is my second language. So I mean, I'm a bright person, but I mean, sometimes I do have to really focus, and so sometimes reading for me is difficult. But like I said, a manual is fantastic, but sometimes just reading it alone is not just beneficial for a person. So we have to look at the well-rounded person, and as our policy says, the holistic, the whole body, mind, soul, and spirit. We have to adjust to also the needs of the board member as well.
Yeah, and that's good to note.
Mhm.
Also, the language as early as possible does not mean as early as convenient. As early as possible really means that this takes a priority, and it should be done as soon as it can be done. And so it's more than convenience. It's more should be more of a driving force than scheduling when convenient.
Even
So
if we
it's pretty.
start with, because not many people would read a manual. 2 pages of any questions, contact. That would be at minimum.
Yeah. Okay. So we can work on that.
Any further questions or discussion? Okay. All right, our next.
The next is tab 27, 9240, board training. I kind of already talked about my recommendations on board training. This is it's got some redundancy because it also covers the orientation for newly elected board members. So this is, just essentially the CSBA model saying that you should continuously inform yourselves related to your responsibilities and participate in training.
Any questions or?
Is this bylaw only pertinent to CSBA, or can it be to other, other outside, organizations as well as like, other conferences, as well? Or only to CSBA pertinent?
So that's a great question. It's much broader than just CSBA. If you
Okay.
look at the fourth paragraph, it says, "Funds for board training shall be budgeted annually for the board and each board member. In selecting appropriate activities, the board and/or individual board members shall consider activities that are aligned with the district's vision and goals and the needs of the board or individual member to obtain specific knowledge and skills." So it's not limited to the CSBA conference, and there are, numerous other organizations that have conferences and training activities that are appropriate for board members, and in some cases targeted just at board members.
Correct.
And so it's just important to know that it should be training that furthers your knowledge and skills related to your role as a board member, and it needs to be board approved. So.
I'm going to call on Ms. Kane to see if you have any suggestion as a student board member for orientation.
I like the idea that when people do the orientation before they actually get elected, just so they have more background knowledge on what they're getting into. And once they start the job, they kind of know like how things will work out.
Thank you so much. And a follow-up question, as the student board member, is there anything that we should look at or revise on the process?
I'm pretty good with everything that has been said.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next.
I think you were going to revisit, I think that's all that we previously identified, but you mentioned at the beginning that you wanted to revisit something that was acted on in June.
Well, I'm not sure if it's that particular policy, but I wanted us to review the ethical clause for board members.
Okay.
So on page 15, so like item number 4, is that more of the ethical standard?
Which tab is that?
Tab 4. Or is that implied?
So tab 4, governance standards, bylaw 9005, and you're identifying the subsection that says act with dignity and understand the implications of demeanor and behavior.
So do we have any questions on that or concerns?
Well, I do have a question that could be targeted under this, if I may.
Go ahead.
As a board member, are there any meetings with staff that I should not attend, such as be put on a committee? I'm familiar with being an observer, but a participant in a committee.
What kind of committee?
Any internal district committee, as a sitting board member, should I not participate in anything? Is there a danger with and without students of my own in the district? Asking for myself.
So participation on committees definitely has Brown Act implications. And if, board-created committees that have continuing subject matter jurisdiction are subject to the Brown Act. You have ad hoc committees composed solely of 2 members of this board are not subject to the Brown Act. There may be superintendent-created committees that are not subject to the Brown Act, that because they're not board-created committees, the superintendent has gathered a working group, for example. So it would depend on the nature of the committee, but also coming back to Board Bylaw 9005 generally is, and I've mentioned this previously, you are always perceived as a board member. And it's important to remember whether we're talking about an internal committee, whether you have volunteered for a state committee or a county committee that's not even necessarily education related, but you still have the mantle of authority because you were recognized as a board member. So whether it's a community event, a district event, anything, there's a perception that you act and speak on behalf of the board, and that's the real focus of 9005, is to say, board members are expected to govern responsibly and hold themselves to the highest standards of ethical conduct. And then board president brought up the implications of demeanor and behavior. So I don't suspect that while participating on a committee that you have demeanor or behavior that is unbecoming a board member. But you also have to remember that anything you say carries greater weight, even though you don't speak for the board unless you speak for the board, right? If the board has appointed you and said you speak for the board in this context, then great, go and speak for the board. But that has Brown Act implications. If you are attending out of interest in knowing what's happening, then I would agree that you should be, very careful in any participation, probably only as an observer, unless you've been authorized to speak for the board, because your words carry so much weight. And if there's a belief that board influence is needed on that committee, then it's something that should be taken up by the board to determine, will we have a board representative on that? And again, that may have Brown Act implications.
What if, for instance, it came up that you may end up having an issue if, for example, there's an ad hoc committee talking about students, and all of a sudden it triggers something within me, that board member, that is sitting on the committee that goes, wow, that may impact my kids.
So answers about financial interests, super well covered under the law, right? But questions about situations that may influence your ability to act without bias. And I don't mean bias in the bad discrimination way. I mean bias in the way that you already have an interest in it. And it will be hard to separate your personal interests from your role as a board member. The common law has explored these issues. Statutes do not cover them, but the common law has. And what the common law says is that you owe a duty of loyalty to the district. And any time that you are acting in an official capacity or influencing a governmental decision related to this school district, your duty is to always act in the best interest of the district. And if there's something in your personal life that prevents you from having 100% loyalty to the district, then you should remove yourself from that decision. So, and that's what the common law doctrine against conflicts of interest says, and like I said before, it covers more than financial interests. It's any interest. So, and that's a tough one to gauge. But think about how many of you have been called to jury duty. Okay, so people always try to get out of jury duty, right? And I always find it really interesting. In the olden days, lawyers didn't get to go to jury duty, but now we get called. I say get to. But people will say stuff like, you know, well, my uncle's a police officer, so maybe I should be off the jury, right? And what does the judge say? The judge says, are you going to be able to look at the facts of this case and make a decision based on the law and the facts? Will you be able to make that decision? And if the person says, well, I always believe the cops. I just always believe it. And I've heard so many stories, and I just think I'm always going to believe the cops. Normally, the judge is going to kick them off the jury, and whether they're telling the truth or not. Maybe I just gave you tips on how to get off the jury. But normally, the judge is going to be afraid to leave that person on the jury.
Hint.
But I'm saying, we're streaming, and I'm saying, ask yourself the same question that you hear in jury duty. Am I going to be able to participate in this committee or in this action? And am I going to be able to listen to all the facts and make a decision based only on the good of the district? Or am I going to think, how does this affect me? How does this affect my child? You can think, how is this going to affect all children? That's your job. How is this going to affect all children in the district? What's in the best interest of, all students? But if it's so personal that you feel like you no longer can be unbiased, that you're going to be, well, I already know how this is going to turn out. I'm not going to be able to make a decision only in the best interest of the district. At that point, you need to call a timeout and remove yourself. That's what the common law doctrine of conflict of interest says.
So abstaining from a vote would not suffice?
So it depends on the context. So normally, yes, if it's a board action, so this is coming before the board, and you feel like, like you have a personal bias, or it would impact you different than it impacts everyone else, and you'd have a hard time making that decision. Now, it's not like a decision under the Political Reform Act or Government Code 1090. You don't have to declare your conflict, and you don't have to put it on the record, and you don't have to leave the room. Okay, those are statutory requirements for financial interests. But normally what people will say is, my child goes to Frisbee, and because this impacts them, I don't want there to be any sort of appearance of impropriety or conflict, so I'm going to abstain. And so you don't vote, and you don't take any part in the consideration of the matter. So that is best practice when either you believe you may not be able to make a decision only in the best interests of the district, or you just want to avoid that perception because you think someone in the community is going to complain about you. So sometimes people will, make the decision on that basis as well. But the rules are not as strict for disclosing a conflict and leaving the room.
Any further questions or comment?
It just highlights that life is more complicated for board members with children in the district, and it's always been that way. And again, you walk around with this apparent authority, and a bunch of other people are watching you, and it just makes life harder in some ways.
I do have a question about ethics training.
Okay.
Recently, I was looking, as always, on the internet, and I saw that FPPC currently offers ethics training for free through the end of this year. But in 2020, well, to finish that thought, at the end of this year, it didn't say, but basically the free training ends. By 2025, board members in school districts are now included in having to take the ethics training. Can you speak to that and make a recommendation what we should do?
Yeah, so a few years ago, the legislature imposed an ethics training obligation for conflicts of interest training on public agencies that didn't include school districts and included a bunch of other public agencies. And they realized, well, maybe we should include school districts as well. So they put that in place. The FPPC, I believe it's an all online module that you can do currently. And so you just go online and you do it. It takes, well, I did it. It took a while. It's pretty long training. I don't know if you did it, but
Yes.
yeah, I did it when it first came out. And it's comprehensive. It's not the most interesting, but it's comprehensive and it's good to do. And so if you want it for free, I didn't know that it was, I did not know that it was not going to be offered for free going forward. So that's why I said, I would say that's a good thing to do, to go, meet your compliance and do it for free. I'd also seek it out if available at the CSBA conference or through CSBA, because they tend to have more interesting and more, experienced presenters than the very sterile FPPC modules. But then you can also obtain it through, other sources, including us. I mean, we offer it as well. So there are a number of ways to meet that requirement,
Thank you.
including free ways for a limited time.
Any further discussions or questions? So I would like for you to give us a wrap-up of the items that we are going to move forward with.
Is there a date so we can take action?
Well, they're going to have their conference and write it up. Right.
Yeah, we'll bring them to you.
All at
First
once.
reading.
So, Martha, were you keeping notes of the, okay, can you go ahead and give the overview?
I can give the numbers, but I think Chris is better as giving a backup of what the
Right.
changes will be.
Yeah, I mean, I can just jump right to it.
Okay.
So Board Bylaw 9010, related to public statements, we're going to provide some clarifying language related to community requests for statements related to the district. We're going to add language related to when the board president may select or designate in consultation with the superintendent, another member of the board to speak on behalf of the board. So the default is the board president speaks on behalf of the board, but you may have a situation where you're going to delegate someone else, another board member, the authority to speak on behalf without going to the whole board for authorization. The board president, in consultation with the superintendent, would make that decision. That, of course, would only happen if you've already have an established policy on point that they can speak to.
And the other clarification is that we need to have either email or snail mail of the organization requesting the speaking.
Clear statement of purpose and timeline,
Right.
community organization. That's
Right.
right, and it's going to be run through the district. Yeah, yeah. Tab 7. We're going to correct the window period set out for the organizational meeting, so we'll update that based on the change in the law. Then we're also going to add language that it's the expectation of the board that no board member will serve more than one consecutive year in the same office, and that the officers will rotate. And so we're going to have expectation language rather than hard and fast requirement language, but it's going to reflect current practice.
Yes, and there is one recommendation. Another board member, Mr. Montez, who isn't here today, and I discussed board members should come in rather than at vice president or clerk, but at the newest position. That way they can learn not only the ropes, maybe they have prior experience or not, but that they will know the district policies, past practices, and have something under their belt that will give them a more solid footing in district affairs. So,
Would that be a prohibition against someone serving as an officer in their first term?
a recommendation.
I like that recommendation.
So kind of a general statement of preference for experienced board members to serve, but again, not a hard and fast rule because you wouldn't want to prohibit someone from being an officer. For example, this past election, a number of school boards had major changes where three new members came in. And a new member was going to be an officer, right? Just because of the numbers. So,
I do believe that would fall under the special circumstances to where, it's, we don't want an inexperienced, officer to not kind of know. It would be in the best interest for the district to have somebody experienced as a president to kind of be able to do, what's best for the district versus having somebody that's not really experienced.
so general preference language, I think, is what I would
Yes.
propose. And,
Well,
but not binding.
I'm going to say it's all relative because you have on a lot of boards, school boards, people who are principals and people who have worked in education and people who have worked in other fields. And so there's an orientation. So I don't think we should assume that just because they haven't been in the role within the district, that they have fulfilled roles. So I think you have to sort of be careful about that because we have a lot of organizational people and talented people. You still have to have process and with any organization. So I don't know about, there's a comfort level, and this is where a decision where you have that vote
Yes.
and it go into conference.
So it could be language that was, just generally new trustees without experience in school districts or other public agencies would not serve as officers.
Well, that's kind of discriminatory to me because just because I'm not in education doesn't mean I haven't served in other committees or have any leadership experience.
It would be, and this is not going to be binding language anyway. So,
I think maybe we think through the process and come up with, the intent of a lot of this feedback. So we can sort of have options of language when we discuss it.
we can, yeah, and
And then
I'll
look
just
at
tell you,
other-
I've seen new board members come in who had been city council members.
Mhm.
No school experience, but they could have come in and run the show, just, from a procedural standpoint. They didn't have the depth of knowledge that other board members had as it related to schools, but they could be a board president because they could run the show. And then they had to rely on their other trustees for the experience and so it's, okay, we'll work.
Yeah.
That's
work.
why the language would be recommended.
Yeah.
It would bring it to the attention of the board, and then it'd be up to, in this case, 3 board members to make that real or not.
Yeah, a reminder of things to consider
Yes.
in selecting.
So that sort of eliminate the automatic rotation language.
Well, not really, because if you start at the bottom, you're rotating up.
Well, you have election, maybe you have 2 or 3 people that are new.
True.
So, so I think it's sort of a customary practice, but I think when they work out the language, they have our intent and
Agreed.
the
Yeah.
feedback with everyone, and then we can sort of fine tune it.
Yeah, and no matter what the information in this, ultimately, anyone with 3 votes will be board president.
Exactly.
And that's, will always be your right, and we're not going to
Correct.
change that.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Board Representatives, tab 16. I didn't have any changes to this. I think it's appropriate as written, and I didn't hear any significant concerns.
Next.
The next was tab 19. The, I'm going to provide some language related to the scope of requests for information by board members and when the superintendent may bring a request back for the full board to consider. You know, what might be considered a burdensome or time-consuming request for information. It would not affect the day-to-day, you know, hey, you know, tell me about this or that type of requests. The there was going to be further discussion with the superintendent and risk management about the, you know, some of the hypothetical situations that were raised with informal requests of students to participate in non-district sponsored activities. So we were going to explore that further, consult with Keenan to see if they have any best practices or information, and we're going to explore that one a little further and see if how we might mix that into, you know, again, to maintain a separation between the official and the purely personal, and try to, you know, clarify that a little bit
And avoid any pitfalls.
and avoid any liability or other pitfalls.
Chris, question for you. Would that include, you mentioned students, but would that include staff? Or the language includes staff already? Or implies?
So, board bylaws generally govern the board in its operations. I'll make a note to look at your other board policies and see if this is covered there as well. So,
The question is, the context is still for board. Whether board can imply a staff member attend certain events.
Oh, it would be the same thing with students.
Correct.
Yeah, so exactly right. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, and we,
Because you gave the example of you and a staff member, and you asking him or her to help you move this weekend.
right.
The implication is that the staff member, your colleague, would, you know, imply that he or she has to do it.
Right, and our student board member, you know, mentioned how compelling it could be to get a request from an authority figure. I think she's not alone. I think your staff would be under the same sort of pressures. So we'll explore that as well. I think okay. Tab 26, orientation. going to work on identifying a class of information that can be provided right away, including possibly before someone's even being sworn in, with the most basic information about the district that would be helpful in someone to immediately hit the ground running. So we're going to explore timeframes for broader orientation. And further explore if we want to get more specific on the information that can be provided beyond that very basic information to be provided right away. And so I'm going to consult with the superintendent on that. Board training, all we did was clarify this, that it's something that board members have a right to get board training approved by the board for anything that would be helpful for their role, whether it's from CSBA or another organization. I didn't have any changes listed for this. And I didn't have any changes identified for behind tab 4 either. I don't know if I started with that or not. So that's my to-do list. I don't know if I captured everything.
I think you have the essence of everything. We just really appreciate being able to update so many board policies that haven't been updated in quite some time, and times have changed. So, getting the new information and the laws. Once again, I'm going to thank the superintendent. I know a lot of times as a board member or a new board member, we're anxious to learn all you can, but the superintendent role is to take care of the district first and foremost. And so sometimes we have to always say we need our superintendent, his designee, to try to fit within his schedule. Because at that time you have break and report cards and testings and restrictions. So I think the flexibility that as board members we have to be conscious of with our requests, because they have timelines and data too. So just, everybody's on that schedule. Would you like to mention anything? Or?
Just wanted to thank you, Mr. Keeler, and your firm. And I won't bill you for that FPPC ethics training.
But I won't bill for that 2 minutes that you explained it to me. So and we'll call it even.
But the campaign, you offered to do maybe a closed session training on that contract and when you abstain. And
That'd have to be open session.
Open session.
Yeah,
okay,
because
so
there's
that
not a
would be-
particular issue.
Okay.
So this would be general training. But what I think you should do is perhaps, and I don't know if Mr. Harris has access to this or if the superintendent, explore your training options. We are happy to provide it, but there may be, free resources that you can use. There may be training through Keenan that they are providing. We're happy to provide it as well. I just don't want to be here selling something to you.
No.
We're here as a resource, and we do have the materials already prepared. So just whatever you need, but you absolutely should do it. It's a legal requirement now, and it's just good to know because especially this new anti-pay-to-play thing, the logistics of it, you're going to be expected to know who you've contracted with when you receive donations. And you're going to have to say no during this 6-month period. If this company got a contract with you and 3 months later wants to give you a campaign contribution, you're supposed to know if the board approved a contract with them. So there's some logistical issues that not only do you need the training, but you're going to have to work out with business services. How are we going to know? Do we have a hotline? Do we have to send you an email? How do we know?
That warrant list booklet, pay closer attention, yeah?
Yeah, so it's really potentially burdensome, and I just never want anyone to get in trouble. So it's something that you need to think about.
Okay, Ms. Dominguez?
Well, thank you so much for the valuable information you gave us. Thank you for everybody for being here on a Saturday. I mean, we could be cutting the lawn, doing laundry, dishes, other important stuff too. I know I can. But, again, thank you, Mrs. Kane, for being here and listening to us and your valuable input. Like our president said, these are things that needed to be updated. And, as a board, we all work together. We all listen to each other. And, we all get the facts before, we make decisions. And, we work together. We have our trials and tribulations. And, as long as we have that open line of communication and we have, let me talk into the mic before I get in trouble. We have that open communication to where, if anything happens, we can always discuss within the Brown Act limits. And we just work together. We work together. We support one another. And, if anything comes awry, then we handle it. We handle it, and we have rights as a community member, and and we have rights as board members, and we're a team. We're a team. As a long life, well, not long life, but my husband has been raised in Rialto for so long. We know so many members of the Rialto area that we've seen kids growing up from being in the belly to graduating. It's amazing to see how these kids flourish, and I'm very honored to be in this position to where I can see these kids grow up and be protected, see their kids grow up. So I'm very happy to be here and be able to lead our district and our school, and and be part of this team. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
Thank you. And our student board member, Ms. Kane Galazzo, your closing remarks?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for being here. It's really great to hear how much the people at the district care about their students and the district all in all. And I've learned so much new information that I will be doing my research on. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. And our superintendent, Dr. Alvin?
Thank you, President Lewis. Much has been stated already, especially staff who are here on a Saturday. I do appreciate you and thank you for being here. It is a learning growth opportunity for each of us. I learned quite a bit today. It was no exception. And I also would like to thank Dr. Keeler. I know he has a Juris Doctorate, but he does not. I only know one attorney who insisted he be called doctor because the Juris Doctorate.
Just for the record, that's not me.
It's not Chris. But I've also noted that it's always the name, then Esquire. And so I took it upon myself to figure out what is Esquire. So it's medieval times shield bearer or shield maker. It was the rank below a knight that was afforded them, especially to the educated and professional class. Later in the United States, especially to lawyers. So that's the backstory to the Esquire title as part of the attorney.
Hey, I like the idea of being a shield. I like that.
Just a quick comment on that. David and Goliath had a shield bearer. I think he perished first.
Oh.
Well, as we wrap up on that note,
Wow.
okay, meeting is adjourned at 11:26.
Actually, can we move, just for the record, move
Let's
second?
move to have adjournment. Motion?
To adjourn.
In second?
Second,
All right, all in favor, aye.
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 And I believe, is lunch provided? Or?
Yes, I'm gonna roll out lunch, 5 minutes,